to change it, to keep it alive. I thank the chair, and I would yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Maine.
Madam President, at a later time, I'm going to speak in strong opposition to the substitute offered by the senator from Arizona. But I must say, Madam President, that he has every right to offer that substitute. We should fully debate it, and then we should vote on it. And I am puzzled by the procedural steps that have been taken this afternoon to curtail the debate and amendment process on this bill without our even trying to get an agreement on the number of amendments, perhaps limiting them to relevant amendments, which I think would have been a fair way to proceed. So much as I'm opposed to the substance of Senator McCain's substitute and believe that it is ill-advised, I do believe that we should have a full debate on it and a vote on it. That's what we're here for. There are many different views on how we should save the Postal Service. But surely all of us ought to recognize that we simply cannot allow the Postal Service to fail. It is the linchpin of a trillion-dollar mailing industry that employs 8.7 million Americans. It is absolutely vital. It also is an American institution whose roots go to our Constitution. And we've worked very hard in a bipartisan way on our Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to come up with a very good bill that would put the Postal Service back on the right track. It would allow it to compassionately downsize its workforce, which it needs to do, painful though that is. We would do it in a compassionate way by giving authority for buyouts and retirement incentives similar to those used by the private sector. And the Postmaster General has said that he believes that he could reduce the number of employees by 100,000 without doing layoffs, but by giving these incentives, particularly since 33%, in fact more than 33% of the Postal Service's employees are already eligible for retirement. Now, Senator McCain has a different view on how we should go about that. He has a different view on Saturday delivery, on rural post offices, on overnight delivery of mail, all of which I think are important. Our bill does not prevent the closure of every single post office, nor does it dictate that a certain number remain open or closed, for that matter. What we do is we set standards. That's the way it should be determined. We have the Postal Regulatory Commission set standards for access to postal services, and those standards are supposed to include consideration of such factors as a distance to the next post office, geography, public transportation, weather, factors like that. That's far better than a one-size-fits-all approach that the senator from Arizona would have, or the approach used by the Postmaster General to target 3,200 post offices without even looking at whether there are alternative and far less expensive way to deliver the services. And there are, Madam Chairman. For example, a rural post office could be co-located in a pharmacy or a grocery store. It could still exist but run different hours, perhaps be open from 7 to 9 in the morning and 5 to 7 at night. I wager that a lot of my constituents would really appreciate that. That would be on their way to work in the morning or on their way home at night. It could co-locate with a state office or a local office, move into town hall, or have a federal agency move in with the post office. It could offers services that are available generally at state and local offices. There's so many creative ways that we can preserve postal services in rural areas and yet reduce costs. And I think the Postal Service needs to be far more creative in its approach. But I do not support the approach that Senator McCain has laid out. One of his proposals would create a new bureaucracy. I thought we were against creating new bureaucracies around here. A new control board that would be over the Board of Governors and would have these dictatorial powers over the Postal Service. That's a proposal that I don't think makes sense. Our approach is to have a commission that would examine the governance of the Postal Service, but perhaps what we should be doing, if there's something wrong with the structure of the Board of Governors, it was substantially revised in 2006, but if there's something wrong with it, we should revamp the Board of Governors, not create this new super bureaucracy on top of it. I agree with the comments of the senator from Massachusetts on Saturday delivery. The provision that Senator McCain has to move directly to 5-day delivery, and his comments, his negative comments on the fact that we would prohibit that from happening for 2 years misunderstands the intent of our bill. It is not to say that might never happen. It is to say that reducing service should be the last resort, not the first option. And the Postal Service has an advantage that it delivers 6 days a week. Now, if in fact, after all the cost and waste and excess has been wrung out of the system and the Postal Service is still not solvent after 2 years, then we may have to move to 5-day delivery. But to give up that advantage immediately, I can tell you what's going to happen. The volume of mail will decline further. And if the volume of mail declines further after having a 26% decline over the past 5 years, what's going to happen? Revenues will plummet once again. So we need to be very careful about cutting service because it leads to mailers leaving the system. And once the big mailers in particular leave the Postal Service, they are not coming back. And the Postal Service will sink further and further into a death spiral. So my approach is to try to keep and grow the customers for the Postal Service. And I think moving to Saturday delivery would drive more mail away and would hurt service and thus decrease the volume. So I do not think that that is a good approach, but the reason for our 2-year delay is not an endless study, as had been described by the senator from Arizona. It is to allow time for the retirement incentives to go into effect, the downsizing of the workforce to go into effect, the workers' comp reforms to go into effect, the new arbitration provisions to go into effect, the administrative efficiencies that we mandate to go into effect, countless provisions of the bill to go into effect. And I believe that if they are aggressively and well implemented by the Postal Service leaders, if they are, that there will be no need to eliminate Saturday delivery. And that is the reason for the provision in our bill. But we recognize that maybe that will not happen. Maybe the provisions will not be aggressively and well implemented, and the Postal Service will find that it needs to take that extra step. But surely our first approach ought to be to implement cuts without hurting service. Let me give you an example of that from my own state. In Hamden, Maine is one of the 2 postal processing centers for the entire state of Maine. The other one is in Scarborough, Maine, in southern Maine. The Hamden facility is absolutely essential for processing mail from the broad reaches of northern Maine, eastern Maine, and parts of western Maine. Under the Postal Service's proposal, the Hamden facility would be closed. That virtually eliminates the possibility of overnight delivery for like two-thirds of the state of Maine by geography. It means that a letter that's mailed from my hometown of Caribou, Maine, in northern Maine, to Presque Isle, Maine, just 10 miles, 11 miles away, would have to make a 600-mile round trip to Scarborough, Maine, in order to be processed and delivered. I can't imagine how many days that's going to take, particularly in the winter, and this is all ground transportation. So that's the kind of ill-conceived decision that our bill is intended to prevent, because it's the kind of decision that's going to cause postal customers to take their business elsewhere. And in proof of that, I received an email from a small business owner in Bangor, Maine, which is the town right next to Hamden, who told me that he'd already received a notice from his payroll company saying, if the Hamden facility closes, then we recommend you move to electronic payroll, or we'll hand deliver the checks from your payroll. So that, again, is lost business for the Postal Service. Now, could things be done at the Hamden facility to save money? Absolutely. If the facility's size is too big compared to the volume of mail it's now processing, reduce the footprint, rent out part of the facility. A major mailer would love to be right in the same building as the Postal Processing Center, could easily be reconfigured to accomplish that. So the Postal Service can do a lot to reduce its costs without doing away with overnight delivery, with Saturday delivery, and with the treatment of first-class mail in the way that we have been accustomed. And, Madam President, and I know coming from New Hampshire, you have a special appreciation for this. The steps that will be taken if we do not act will leave rural America behind. Not every part of my state has access to broadband. We talk all the time about, oh, people can go on the Internet. Well, they can't in parts of my state. We're making progress in that area, but there are many rural areas in Maine that do not have access to broadband, so they do not have alternatives. Weekly and daily newspapers would be at a terrible disadvantage if overnight delivery is no longer available for two-thirds of the state of Maine. Think about that. Think what it means for bill paying for small businesses sending out bills to their customers. Think what it means to elderly individuals who are receiving prescription drugs through the mail. Very common in my state, which is one of the states with the oldest populations in the nation. A lot of our elderly in Maine are, particularly in the winter months, are essentially homebound, and they rely on getting those pharmaceuticals through the mail. So if you do away with Saturday delivery, close the processing plant, no more overnight delivery, Monday holidays as well. I've talked to the Postmaster General, and he's conceded to me that even a first-class package or letter mailed on a Thursday would not arrive till a Tuesday. That's a long time when you're waiting for vital medication. So Our approach, our fundamental premise, is to recognize that the Postal Service must become leaner, more streamlined, more efficient. It must downsize to respond to declining volume. But it must be smart in how it does so. And it must do so in a way that does not alienate more of its customers. Because if it loses more of its customers, volume will decline and revenues will decline. It really is that simple. And that is why this bill has been so carefully crafted. This is not the bill that I alone would have proposed, and I think that's true of all four of the sponsors of this bill. But we did what we're supposed to do in the Senate. We worked together. We had countless meetings. At times, I think the senator from Connecticut will agree, endless meetings, and to hammer out these provisions, to strike compromises. We consulted widely with our colleagues, with GAO, with the Postal Service, with large mailers and small mailers, with the greeting card industry, with newspaper industry, with the magazine publishers, anyone who had a stake, with the postal unions. And we got their suggestions and we crafted the bill to the best of our ability. We worked hard on it, and I think it is a good bill. And I am very disappointed and indeed puzzled why we can't now proceed with debate on amendments on this bill and why we have a cloture motion on this bill already filed. That makes no sense to me. We're acting in good faith. We're open for business right now. We could be taking up amendments right now. And I hope that the leader will reconsider and allow us to do this bill in the usual way. I would pledge to him, and he knows I'm sincere in this, to work with him to try to come up with amendments and see if we can go back and forth, side to side, and start working through them. We're here. We're open for business. We're ready to go. And this bill matters. This bill matters. Our economy is still very fragile. And if the Postal Service stops delivering mail this fall, it will be a crushing blow to this economy. Or if it stops delivering mail in certain areas, or the mail's very slow, it will also hurt this economy. And we cannot leave rural America behind. The mandate of the Postal Service is universal service. That means whether you live in the far reaches of Alaska or at the bottom of the Grand Canyon in Arizona or on an island off the coast of Maine, you're supposed to be able to have access to the Postal Service. It's one of the things that unites us as a country. So I would urge my colleagues for us to come together in good faith here and work through what I believe is a very important bill with a vital mission, and that is to save the United States Postal Service. Thank you, Madam President.
President.
The senator from Connecticut.
I thank the chair. Madam President, I want to thank my dear friend and colleague from Maine, my really not ranking member, but sort of co-chair partner of our committee, for her excellent statement. And I share her frustration about the procedural moment we're at in the Senate on this bill. I hope and I believe that this is temporary, that Senator Reed's intention is to do exactly what Senator Collins has said she would like to see happen, which is that we negotiate an agreement, hopefully it'll have to be adopted by consent, but we can do it amendment by amendment where we go back and forth and consider amendments from each side of the aisle. It's not as if, I know Senator Reid has filled the tree, it's not as if there are not amendments that members of the Senate Democratic Caucus want to offer to the bill. There are. There are several of them. And I know there are several on the Republican side. We worked very hard on this bill. As Senator Collins has said, the meetings did seem endless. I would probably say it sometimes seemed excessively endless. But nonetheless, we reached across the aisle and we reached a compromise. But this is not a perfect piece of work, and it's an important subject, so it deserves to be considered, debated, and amendments to be offered. And I'm confident that that's exactly the direction in which the majority leader wants to go. The sooner, the better. Having said that, and seeing no one else on the floor, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, we're debating this bill today because the Postal Service is facing, as many of us know, a dire financial crisis that literally threatens its very survival. This is a crisis that's been building for some time. It's one that only Congress can fix at this point, and one that we absolutely must fix now, literally in a matter of weeks. Since the Postal Service was first established in 1971 in its current form, we've taken it for granted that our mail would arrive and that important business and personal correspondence would reach its destination. In addition, businesses large and small have come to rely on the mail to reach new customers and to communicate effectively with existing customers. The Postal Service has a presence in virtually every community of any size in our country, large and small. It supports a $1 trillion mailing industry that creates and sustains millions of private sector jobs. I'm told as many as 8 million private sector jobs today. Unfortunately, a number of those jobs are at great risk today. They're at risk because those of us in Congress have to date proven either unwilling or unable to come to consensus around a package of reforms that can update the Postal Service's networks and business model to reflect the reality that it faces today, if you will, to right-size the enterprise, much as the auto industry has right-sized its enterprise in the last 3 or 4 years. The lack of action on our part comes despite ample warnings about the severity of the problem and about the consequences of not appropriately and effectively solving that problem. Nearly 2 years ago, former Postmaster General Potter announced, I think with the help of three major consulting companies, that the Postal Service would run up cumulative losses of more than $230 billion extra by 2020 if we did nothing. Now, there are several reasons for these losses, including the diversion of first-class mail to electronic forms of communication and legislative hurdles that Congress has imposed on reform efforts. Mr. Potter and his successor, Pat Donahue, have done a tremendous job, I believe, in trying to chip away at these losses with the help of their employees, with the help of several of their unions, with the help of a number of their customers, and I think from time to time with help from those of us who serve in the Congress in the last administration and the current administration. Over the past decade, the Postal Service has reduced the size of its postal workforce by roughly a third, not by firing people, not by laying people off, but through attrition. They've closed scores of mail processing facilities across America with no noticeable impact on service. People still drop letters or packages in the mail, and they might be delivered the next day or within at least 3 days. Pretty amazing when you think about it. And the approval rating for the Congress isn't very high, but the customer satisfaction of the American people with respect to the Postal Service is still about 85%. Pretty good compared to how we're doing here in our nation's capital. The Postal Service has introduced some new products, such as flat rate boxes if it fits, it ships. They form productive partnerships with companies like UPS and FedEx. UPS and FedEx don't want to deliver every package, every parcel to every mailbox or address across America. Postal Service does that 6 days a week. And the Postal Service has a nice partnership with FedEx and UPS in order to make money for the Postal Service and provide good customer service in that partnership. But despite that, losses at the Postal Service continue to mount. Last year, the Postal Service suffered an operating loss of more than $5 billion. It will see a similar loss this year, even if it finds some ways to avoid making the retiree health pre-funding payments due in coming months. Then the losses accelerate to $6.5 billion in 2013, to $10 billion in 2014, to more than $12 billion in 2015, and to more than $15 billion alone in 2016. But these losses are only theoretical. I say that because the Postal Service is close to exhausting its $15 billion line of credit with the Treasury, and by this time next year, will be well on its way to running completely out of cash. If that were to occur, the Postal Service's ability to continue operating will be in jeopardy. Postmaster General Donohue has said repeatedly that he and his team will do everything that they can do to keep the mail moving even as the Postal Service's finances deteriorate. I believe him. But make no mistake, if the Postal Service is not permitted in the very near future to begin making the adjustments needed in response to the likely permanent declines in mail volume, especially first-class mail, that we witnessed in recent years, that Postal Service will drown in red ink. The ripple effect of losing the Postal Service and the still very valuable services it provides would deliver a body blow to our economy at the very time that our economy is recovering. We are on the brink of this impending disaster in part because we're expecting the Postal Service of 2012 to try and be successful with a business model created in the 1970s. Let's just remember, in 1970, when I was a naval flight officer on my first tour in Southeast Asia, there was no email. There was the mail. Happiest day of the week was when the mail came. Letters, cards, packages, magazines, newspapers, you name it. That was the week. That was the day of the week to live for. Last time I was over in Afghanistan, Senator Lieberman, Senator Collins have been there any number of times. Last time I was there, they still get mail. Our guys and gals still get mail. But you know what else they have? They have Skype. They have telephones. They have these little phones that just like we carry around. They have the Internet. They have Facebook. They have Twitter. They got all that stuff. And as a result, they don't use the mail like we did in our generation. Today, Americans live and work online. We shop and transact more and more business online. And these trends are likely to accelerate. If any of our colleagues doubt that, then they should ask our pages, these pages that are sitting right down here, how often do they sit down and write a letter or send a greeting card? They should ask, our colleagues should ask members of their own staff how often they pay their bills through the mail. They or we should look at our own mail. In fact, when I asked my staff to do this, I said, go back and look at 2001, my first year as a senator. Go back and see, if you look at the number of emails we got then and the number of letters we got then, what was the ratio? And for roughly every 15 letters we got in 2001, we got one email. One email. I said, go back and look at 2011. They did. And as it turned out, for every one letter we received last year, we received about a dozen emails. Think of that. The federal government itself is even contributing to this trend, and I think in a pretty big way. It was just announced within the last week or so that Social Security Administration, starting next year, will send virtually all of its 73 million payments, I think that's each month, to Social Security recipients, and they'll now be processed online through direct deposit, not mailed out. And that's us. So even as the American people adjust to new communication technologies, many of us here in Congress expect the Postal Service to continue as if nothing has changed. But in these changing times, these challenging times, we need to recognize that difficult choices need to be made. It is not efficient or affordable to maintain a mail processing and delivery network built for the peak mail volumes of years ago. That said, many of my colleagues have legitimate concerns about the severity and speed of the Postal Service's streamlining efforts. To address those concerns, the manager's amendment that Senators Lieberman, Collins, Brown, and I have put forward include a number of safeguards crafted to ensure that the changes that will occur in the coming months and years are implemented in responsible ways, ways that are consistent with what I can describe as a golden rule, that we would treat others the way we want to be treated, and that includes customers of the Postal Service, employees of the Postal Service, and taxpayers of this country. We also seek to provide assurances in our manager's amendment that those who still rely largely on the Postal Service, including rural customers without access to broadband, will continue to have access to the services that they know and need in the years to come. We also take steps in this bill with this manager's amendment to ensure that this effort to save the Postal Service isn't all about closing facilities and cutting services. Recognizing that questionable policy decisions made over the years regarding the Postal Service's pension and health care obligations are a part of the Postal Service's financial problems, we call for, in this manager's amendment, refunding the more than $10 billion that the Postal Service has overpaid into the federal employee retirement system. A portion of that refund, that $10 or $12 billion, whatever it turns out to be, would be used to encourage at least some of the 125,000 postal employees at or near retirement age today to retire now or within the next year or two, saving the Postal Service billions of dollars annually. Let me just back up for a moment. If you go back a decade or so ago, there were roughly 900,000 men and women who worked for the Postal Service, for us, in the Postal Service. Today, there are 550,000 people who are employees of the Postal Service. Out of that roughly 550,000 people, 125,000 are eligible to retire, and they have not chosen to do so, despite the fact that they are eligible. One of the things that the Postmaster General wants to do, and I believe that our managers, those of us that are co-sponsors, co-authors of this bill and the Manager's Amendment want to do, is to encourage those folks to retire. 80% of the Postal Service's costs are personnel costs. And to the extent that we can continue to right-size this enterprise, enable it to right-size itself given their market share from 550,000, 500,000 down to maybe 450,000 in the next year or two, in an enterprise where 80% of the cost is personnel, that helps get this enterprise back into a place where it's not bleeding money every day, of every week, of every month of this year. Today, the Postal Service will lose, get this, $23 million. Today. And today, if you look at the amount of money that the Postal Service owes to the Treasury on its line of credit, roughly $13 billion, maybe more than that, with a line of credit that only goes up to $15 billion. There's some controversy that flowed out of the 2006 legislation signed by former President Bush. He insisted at the time, and in order to sign that legislation, that we would have in the Congress to agree to, I think, maybe the most conservative approach to pre-funding in retiree health benefits of any government agency or any business I've ever been associated with. I used to be treasurer of my state government, and we began pre-funding health benefits for retirees several years ago, actually right at the end of my second term as governor, but nothing like this. We instituted that requirement in order to get President Bush to sign on the bill at a time when the public Postal Service was in good shape. That was a very profitable year, if you will, for the Postal Service, before like the roof fell in and the economy went to heck in a handbasket. But the Postal Service is in pretty good shape, in very good shape, so the taxpayers wouldn't be saddled with those obligations in the event that the Postal Service couldn't meet them in the years to come. President Bush's people said, look, we'll sign this bill. We want to make sure that the Postal Service won't always be making money, as they were in 2006. And when 10, 15 years down the line, when they're not doing so well, we want to make sure that a large part of their health care benefits for retirees have been set aside or paid for. And that's not an entirely bad idea. We didn't know that we're going to enter the worst recession since the Great Depression in 2008. We didn't know we were going to lose 2.5 million jobs in the second half of 2008. We didn't know we were going to lose 2.5 million jobs in the first half of 2009, but we did. And it put us in the tank, and it put the Postal Service in the tank in far quicker than I think anybody had a reasonable right to imagine. But in the retrospect, the payment schedule put into place back then proved to be too aggressive once the bottom fell out of our economy in 2008. Our manager's amendment scraps the schedule adopted in 2006, replaces it, I think, with a more realistic one that's based on what the Postal Service actually owes. And that change, coupled with some others, including one that would better coordinate postal retirees' Medicare and federal employee health benefit plan benefits, would cut the Postal Service retiree health costs by more than half. Not ignore them, but cut them in half and put them on a more realistic time schedule. Finally, our manager's amendment pushes the Postal Service to redouble its efforts to innovate, to redouble its efforts to develop new products that can grow revenue going forward. There are some who would argue that, let me just dwell on that for just a moment. Mr. President, there are, frankly, somewhere down the line, I don't know if it's a year from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, somebody's going to say, a light will go on in somebody's head, and they'll say, you know, the Postal Service goes to every door in America 5, 6 times a week. They're in every community in America. Why didn't we think of a particular idea to enable them to create a new source of revenue or new sources of revenue? And I just want to mention some that are actually working. Flat rate boxes, if it fits, it ships. Great product. The partnerships that the Postal Service has with FedEx and UPS, delivering by the Postal Service last mile or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 miles. For FedEx or UPS don't want to go in many cases, that's a good way to make money, especially as more people buy things, order things for themselves, for their families, for their loved ones over the Internet and have it shipped. The Postal Service can have a big piece of that business. And there are other ideas as well. FedEx or UPS, they get to deliver wine and beer. Postal Service doesn't. We changed that in this legislation. There are ideas like they're called electronic mailboxes. We'll hear more about those in the days to come. Other countries with postal services, they actually have used that as a way to provide a good service for their people and for their businesses. And I think there's maybe an argument that we should allow the Postal Service here to do that, too. Well, even further down the road and kind of out there ideas is, as our presiding officer knows, in neighboring Pennsylvania, they don't have a coastline, but they're close to ours and to New Jersey. But 5, 6 years from now, we're going to have windmill farms off the coast of the United States, East Coast, from North Carolina, Virginia, all the way up to Maine. They're going to be harvesting the wind, turning that wind into electricity. And you know what? The wind doesn't always blow. But there's sometimes that it blows a lot more than we're going to generate more electricity than we can actually use on a particular day at a particular hour. What are we going to do with that electricity? Well, we're going to store it. And where we're going to store it? One of the places to store it is in the batteries of fleets of vehicles. Who has one of the biggest fleets in America? The Postal Service. And a lot of the vehicles in their fleet are like 25, even 30 years old. And we have all these new vehicles coming to the market where far more energy efficient to replace those old, in some cases dilapidated fleet vehicles in the Postal Service. And the new vehicles with their batteries can literally be a place to receive the electricity generated on a windy day in the Atlantic, out in the outer continental shelf, to store that electricity, and when needed, put it back out on the grid, the electric grid, to provide energy as needed across the northeastern, mid-Atlantic part of our nation. That's an idea that's sort of out there. But we need to be thinking boldly, and the Postal Service needs to be doing that. I think one of the better pieces of our amendment, and this came from some of the more progressive members of the Democratic Party, and kind of and kind of joined up with some of the more conservative folks on the Republican side. But the idea is the Postal Service needs to be more entrepreneurial. They need to be more innovative. And we need when they come up with good ideas for making money, and including like the idea we talked to at lunch and caucus we had today. How about vote by mail? In 2 states today, Oregon, Washington, they vote by mail. And what does it do to turnout, voter turnout? I think we were told by Senator Cantwell in her state last year, 2 years ago in the election, had 72% voter turnout. And this year they're expecting 84% voter turnout. I mean, this is a country where we're lucky to have 50% of the people who are eligible to actually turn out to vote. And we can see that what vote by mail can do in those 2 states, and they could be sort of laboratories of democracy for our nation. Encourage voter turnout, maybe do it in a more cost-effective way, and, get this, provide this new source of revenue, I think a great source of revenue for the Postal Service. That's the sort of thing we need to keep in mind. I don't think there's any one silver bullet, but I'd like to say there's a lot of silver BBs, and some of them are pretty big, and those might be among them. And there's ideas we haven't even thought of yet we ought to do. Let me just say, and I'm getting fairly close to the end, Mr. President, but I don't mean to suggest that what Manager's Amendment, the underlying bill, reported out of committee by about a 9-to-1 vote. The Manager's Amendment, crafted by Senators Lieberman, Collins, Brown, myself, is not perfect. Very few things associated with my name have ever been perfect. But I would say this. One of my core values, some of you have heard me say this maybe too many times, if it isn't perfect, make it better. If it isn't perfect, make it better. And we have the opportunity to take what we believe is a manager's amendment, an improvement over the original bill. We have the opportunity to make it better. And I don't think in this case, they're not just like Republican ideas. They're not just Democratic ideas. They're not liberal ideas. They're not conservative ideas. They're just better ideas. Better ideas. And my hope is that members will have the opportunity in the days this week, in the days to come to this floor and to offer their better ideas. I would plead with our colleagues, don't just come to the floor and offer amendments that have absolutely nothing to do with Postal Service. Please come to the floor to offer amendments that can help make this bill better with respect to ensuring that we have a Postal Service that's viable and solvent in the 21st century, that can meet our communications needs for individuals, for families, and for business. This is not, we're not going through like a fire drill here. This is an emergency. This is an emergency. It's a huge challenge, but it's also an opportunity to get it right this time. And hopefully with a growing economy to maybe have a little bit of the wind to our backs. We have to pass a bill. My hope is we can pass a bill with bipartisan support. It's good underlying public policy so that we end up in 2016. The Postal Service won't be running daily losses of $23 million a day like they are today. The Postal Service will have had an opportunity to use this refund that they're owed by the Federal Employee Retirement System, $12 billion or so, to pay down much of their debt. Maybe use a little bit of that money to help incentivize some of the 125,000 postal employees that are eligible to retire to go ahead and retire. And we can do this in a way, I know a bunch of our colleagues are concerned. We hear it, Senator Lieberman and I, and Senator Collins and Brown, we hear from our colleagues every day, they're concerned about rural post offices. Believe it or not, we have some of those in Delaware. We have some of those in Connecticut and certainly in Maine, even some in Massachusetts. And I think we've actually come up with a pretty good approach here. And we appreciate very much the input of people like John Tester from Montana and Jerry Moran from Kansas, those senators, one a Democrat, one a Republican, to try to give us a better idea on how to move forward on post offices. Let me just close with this. There are 33,000 post offices in America, in communities across the country. A year or so ago, the Postal Service, the Postmaster General met with us on our committee, and he said, we have 3,700 of those post offices under review that we think maybe should be closed. 3,700. There are at the time about 500 mail processing centers across the country that the post office has for processing mail. And he said, we would like to close about 300 of them. 300. We'd like to change the standard of delivery for mail from 1 to 3 days to maybe 2 to 3 days. Some were afraid it was going to slip from 2 to 3 to 2 to 4, or even worse. Where we've ended up with it is manager's amendment. I'd say to folks, our colleagues that are concerned about, the impact that this will have on their rural post offices or on their mail processing centers, here's where we've ended up. The Postal Service has pretty much backed off and said, we're not that much interested in closing 3,700 post offices or 2,700 or 1,700 post offices. What they really would like to do is this. I think it's a smarter, actually more cost-effective approach, more humane approach. And that is to say to communities across America where we have a post office where maybe the postmaster's making $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year in a post office where they're selling like $15,000 or $20,000 worth of stamps. Rather than just like close that post office, provide that community with a menu of options. And the menu of options would be maybe keep the post office open, say to the postmaster there who's eligible to retire, we'd like to incentivize you to retire. Here's a $25,000 bonus if you'll go ahead and retire. You can retire, receive your pension, be eligible for benefits as a postal retiree, and come back and work on a part-time basis and run that post office for 2 hours a day, 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day, whatever the community feels meets their needs, morning or afternoon or mid-afternoon, evening. And that retired postmaster money that they collect, they keep. They don't have to reduce their pension. It's just extra money that they can make for continuing to provide this service. We still have the post office there. The flag still flies in front of it. That's one option. Another option might be like to put that, if the folks in the community wanted to put that post office in a supermarket. One of the supermarkets that we, it's close to my house in Delaware, they have a supermarket, they have a pharmacy, they have a bank. It turns out one of our major national chains of pharmacy, Walgreens, was up in visiting their headquarters, their office is up in Chicago. I don't know if the chairman's been there, Chairman Lieber's been there, but the pharmacy of the future, they took me to a couple of them, has beautiful pharmacy. Part of it is a post office. And so you could see in places across the country if they might make sense to consolidate the post office in like a Walgreens or some other kind of pharmacy or convenience store. It might make sense to say you've got a small town, they have a town hall and that kind of thing. How about consolidating those buildings together to the post office? We've even heard of ideas like create kind of an internet cafe in places where they don't have broadband and see if we can't have in rural post offices where folks who live there in that community, in that area, they don't have broadband access, maybe have it at the post office. There's just all kinds of ideas that are out there. And on the mail processing side, instead of closing 500 mail processing centers across the country, Postmaster General has come to us. We work to maintain, not to go from 1 to 3 day service, from there to 2 to 3 day service or 2 to 4 day service, to maintain kind of like a 1 to 3 day service, one with an asterisk. And the 1 day service would be overnight service, next day service in communities like if they're in the same metropolitan area. They would still get next day service. And outside of that metropolitan area, they might, but in most cases it would be 2 day service. In no case it would be worse than 3 day service. And by going to this modified service standard delivery, the Postal Service wouldn't have to close 500 mail processing centers. Probably be able to close maybe 150. They'd be able to offer incentives to those employees to retire. They could migrate to other jobs within the Postal Service. But it would be, I think, maybe a smarter way to move this large, old, but still germane, relevant Postal Service into the 21st century. I'll close with this. This is not the time to kick the can down the road. I have no interest in doing that. I know Senator Lieberman, Senator Brown, Senator Collins have no interest in doing that. This is a time to fix the problem, I'd like to think we're smart enough here in the Senate to fix this problem. I'd like to think that we're smart enough for the Senate to working with the House, with our staffs, with a lot of good people, the folks at the Postal Service, the folks who work there, the unions, their customers, and a lot of people are in businesses all over the country. Together working on this, I think we're smart enough to figure out how to solve this. And we need to do that. Last thought. During the recess, I mentioned to my colleagues, presiding officer, to Senator Lieberman during our caucus lunch today, I said, you know, I know what you guys and gals did over the Easter recess. I basically just covered Delaware like a glove. I love to do it. It's great joy. I go back every night anyway, but it's just great joy. And y'all know what I mean, to kind of reconnect with everybody. And I also spent some time on the phone and meeting with folks who are in businesses in Delaware and outside of Delaware who rely on the Postal Service. Nationwide, there are 7 to 8 million people whose jobs are integrated or part of or facilitated by our Postal Service. 7 to 8 million jobs. We are coming out of the worst recession since before I was born, before we were born. And we need to get out of it. And one of the best ways to do that is to provide certainty, predictability for a lot of businesses. One way to do that is to pass postal reform legislation that finishes the job we started 5, 6 years ago. We can do that. We need to do that. And I'm encouraged that we will do that. I want to thank the chairman of the committee, whom I love working with, as I think we all do. And thank him for giving me a chance to work a little bit with him on this issue and to providing the great leadership that he always does. And to say to my friend Susan Collins, who just left the floor, that it's been just a real privilege to work with her. And finally, to our staffs. We're just blessed with really wonderful people, as Joe knows, and wonderful people that are on our staffs. And John Kilverton and others that are part of my staff, and Michael and the team that are part of your staff, and Kate, who works with Senator Collins. They've done great work, hard work maybe, and we're pleased and privileged to be able to work with them. Thank you. With that, I yield my time.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I want to thank my friend, the senator from Delaware, for his excellent statement on the bill and where we are in regard to the U.S. Postal Service. Really, I want to thank him for what he's done over the last several years to try to save the U.S. Postal Service in a changing environment and to lead the change. No one in the Senate, I believe no one in the Congress, has worked harder over the last decade to reform the U.S. Postal Service than Senator Tom Carper. And there's a way in which he is engaged by the kinds of problems that others try to get far away from. He sees an institution like the U.S. Postal Service. He knows how important it is. And he's challenged by it, and he goes at it with all of his considerable capabilities and persistence until he gets it right. And I can't thank him enough for doing that. This is not the kind of issue on which you gain a lot of political advantage, but it's again a test of our government. It's a test of our capacity to maintain public services that people depend on in a changing world. And we all know, he's been the leader in this, that email is affecting the volume of mail. And the post office has to change to stay not only viable but strong. And I think we're going to do it in this Congress, and no one will deserve more credit for that than Senator Tom Carper. I'm glad I had the chance spontaneously to offer that much-deserved gratitude and praise to Senator Carper. I want to say to my colleagues and staff that may be watching or listening, just to pick up a theme that Senator Carper spoke and try to bring it home. There are some amendments on both sides. They ought to be aired out. I believe that Senator Reid really wants to do that, wants to create a process where relevant amendments from both sides, not without limit, but a good number of them get the chance to be debated here on the floor. It's my understanding that both caucuses now are hotlining a request to Senate offices. If you have an amendment you want to introduce on this postal reform bill, let your respective cloakroom know so we can see what the universe is, and then see if we can work on an agreement where we alternate submitting amendments, and we can begin to get into the substance of the bill and hopefully move it to a point where before long we can actually adopt something. So I thank the chair, and I would yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.